So that is the recording started. And welcome everybody to session three. I'm not necessarily sure that it's going to make sense to keep counting sessions. At a certain point, we're going to be at session, 18 or whatever it is. Um, but for now, it's session three. We're continuing chapter one of Pirkei Avot. So um, we will do a quick recap and then continue on in chapter one. Um, And the recap is just very quickly taking a look at the texts that we looked at previously from a vote. There are, commentaries and things like that that I pulled in. Those aren't part of what we're looking at as part of the recap. But we'll talk about some terminology and I'll bring up some terms that we'll be using later, primarily other commentaries that we'll talk about later. So our first four that we used or that we looked at were the first one is the transmission that the rabbi said existed from Moses down to the men of the Great Assembly who are um, post-exile, so after 586 BCE and after the return from exile. Um, that's this chain of transmission that gets started. And they said three things: be patient in judgment, establish many students, and make a fence around the Torah. The second statement is Shimon the righteous, who was among the last of those folks. And he said, the world stands upon three things: upon Torah, upon sacrificial worship at the temple, and upon deeds of loving kindness. And you'll remember that when I rendered some of these translations, I tried to make them very time bound in the sense of being situated in the world of the rabbis and of the rabbis who made these statements. So we are accustomed to seeing people say the world stands on Torah upon service and upon deeds of loving kindness. And it's really more like the world, according to Shimon the righteous, stands on Torah, sacrificial worship at the temple, which is really what the rabbis were referring to there. And then rather than deeds of loving kindness, which is the common translation, that it really is deeds of religious dedication. Um, Avot 1:3 was Antigonus receiving from Shimon, and he used to say, don't be like workers who serve the master in expectation of receiving a reward. Rather, be like workers who serve without expecting to receive an award, and let fear of heaven be upon you. Right? This idea that don't expect to be rewarded for your work with Torah or the work of judging or the work of being a rabbi. That's not the point. And then we have Avot 1:4, Yosei son of Yoezer of Tsereda and Yosei son of Yochanan of Jerusalem. And now we're getting a group of rabbis that are called the pairs because there's two of them at any given time. Um, in this case, they both happen to be named Yosei. That's a just historical coincidence. Receive Torah. Yosei, son of Yoezer of Tsereda, says, your house should be a council house for the wise, and you should be one who wrestles in the dust of their feet and be one who drinks thirstily their words. With this idea that make your house be a place where these rabbis, who are not the dominant political power of their time, make your house be a place where they convene. That the tradition has kind of read this over the centuries as because then you'll learn stuff because they're around, but it sort of misses the existential desperation of the rabbis of this period, who aren't even calling themselves rabbis yet, by the way. But they are not the people in power. And so they actually need places to assemble to be able to do anything. And that this language of wrestling in the dust of their feet and being one who drinks thirstily their words, this idea that Torah study is supposed to be elemental and something that you grapple with, um, and something that implies hierarchy, because students sit at the feet and the teacher sits on the bench. Right, this is one of the descriptions that comes up. Um, So we have those in the background, bringing out some of the terminology. The thing that you're most likely to hear is I'm going to say Mishnah or Mishnayot when I'm referring to what you would call, if we were reading the Bible, you would call them verses. These are called Mishnah. Mishnah is one, Mishnayot are multiple, these repeated statements. And we talked in the first session about how these statements are actually structured for easy memorization and repetition from memory, often by a person who was called, in the context of the rabbinic classroom, a Mishnah, a repeater. And we talked a lot last time about Bartanura, which is really kind of the way that the tradition refers to the commentary on the Mishnah by Rabbi Ovadia of Bartanura in Italy, the blue Moscato bottle. Um, I had a picture of the blue Moscato bottle from Bartonura Vineyards. Um, Bartonura's commentary is the primary commentary on the Mishnah used in kind of traditional Jewish study of the Mishnah. And a lot of what he does is he looks at the Talmud and he looks at Rashi and he summarizes that so that you aren't just reading the Mishnah in isolation, you're kind of reading it against the background of the broad tradition as it develops up to the 1400s when he's working. So I'll mention Bartonura. We're going to see stuff from Bartonura because it makes sense as we're going through to kind of know, okay, this is where the tradition goes with it. We're going to be using a number of different commentaries, and there are some translations out there that you might or might not want to look at. I know that some people want to have a copy or want to look in advance at what we're doing or want to go back and look at another translation. So, in terms of translations, we're kind of really on the bottom half of the page or the bottom half of the slide. The Culp translation is the easiest one to find because it's at a website called Sepharia.org and is kind of the one that Sepharia has made its default. It comes with a series of explanatory notes, which more or less is a commentary, written by Joshua Culp, who is an American scholar moved to Israel and is head of the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem. So he is the head of the conservative movements, the U.S. conservative movements training school in Israel. Um, I have this one listed because I'm using it now, although I'm not using it for our translation so much as I'm using it for its commentary and notes. This is a 3 volume work by edited by Shia Cohen, Robert Goldenberg, and Chaim Lapin. Chaim Lapin teaches at University of Maryland. Um, they put together, they edited, there are a number of scholars involved with it, a 3 volume set. Um, this is just the volume that has a vote in it. A 3 volume set that is a translation and commentary-ish thing and notes of the entire Mishnah. So a vote is in there. Um, I've been using it in part because it's still another translation, another way to look at how they translated things, but it also talks about multiple manuscript traditions. And so there's opportunity to kind of compare and contrast um, what's happened in the text over time and alternate readings. And we're actually going to see one today. Um, so it's not just a, hey, this is a thing you can use. It is not an inexpensive purchase, so I'm not suggesting you go out and get it. Um, I just kind of had to accept that, yeah, I'm going to be using this thing for, probably the rest of my life. I may as well suck it up and get it. Um, the Koran translation of Pirkei Avot, which I've covered up over here, is this slim little blue volume. The translation is by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. The commentary is by Rabbi Mark Angel. Um, it is it's not a particularly historically informed commentary. It's a little bit more. moral edification focused with some history and things like that pulled in. Mark Angel has a PhD in ancient history and can do that kind of work, but that's not really what this text is aimed at. And then most conservative Orthodox prayer books that have a Shabbat afternoon service in them will have Pirkei Avot because Pirkei Avot is studied during the summer months on Shabbat afternoons in many conservative and Orthodox congregations. So in addition to all of these, I mentioned a work called Avot de Rabbi Natan, Rabbi Natan's Avot, or um, the the fathers according to Rabbi Nathan. There's a lot of ways of translating it, um, which is not really a commentary in the same way that we think of commentaries as being. It's considered a minor tractate of the Talmud, but it doesn't really work like the Talmud either. Um, they're these kind of sermon style commentaries on a vote. So it talks about it talks about the subjects, but in a more free ranging way, and it kind of pulls in biblical references and things like that. It really reads like um, midrash more than it does commentary. And it's probably from the 8th to 10th century in Babylonia, so it bops in and out of Hebrew and Aramaic at points. And then Bartanura, which again originally in Hebrew, but a lot of Bartanura has been translated into English at Sepharia.org as well. So you can kind of find Pirkei Avot, click on a verse, and it'll pull up a pane on your web browser that then lets you look at commentaries and things like that. So I've used all of these at various points looking at materials today, other than, I mean, how many more translations do I need? I have not been whipping out the prayer books to look at their particular takes on the translation. Okay.
Um,
Yes.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I have a sort of question,
Okay.
maybe an observation, which is I'm looking at the Koran,
Hmm.
uh, and on number 4, when they're talking about having guests at your house, sages at your house, um, in the commentary underneath, it, it cites Yoram Hazoni,
Hmm.
and it says that he says, well, it's a good idea to have these various sages at your house and hear all kinds of points of view, but it's important that you don't just adopt what anyone says, any one sage says, that you hear them all and come up with your own point of view. The reason I'm pointing it out was Yoram Hazoni. I don't know when this was written. I tried to figure that out, this commentary here, because Yoram Hazoni, I don't claim to be an expert, but I've come across him as a leading person in this NatCon movement, this very right-wing movement. Um, he was a leading speaker in these annual conferences
Hmm.
and in Israel as well. And he's got quite a clear um, ultra right-wing philosophy. And I just thought it was interesting that he was quoted. Maybe he wasn't into all these ideas then, or maybe it's considered irrelevant, but it's not, he's not a great believer in liberal democracy at this time.
No. Yeah. So Yoram Hazoni, um, Yoram Hazoni is kind of cited in this in Angel's commentary as a way of saying, oh, the biblical editors are trying to get you to take a place within the tradition of their inquiry and continue its elaboration. And the commentary for that is presented with Korn is saying the Talmud's trying to do that too. and don't surrender your intellectual freedom in the process, which is kind of the opposite of where Yoram Hazony's politics have gone over the last 10 or so years. Um, although he would probably say, no, 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 an intellectual free thinker.
Hmm.
Um, Corin, as a publisher, is kind of odd. Um, they're modern Orthodox. They're also sort of open Orthodox friendly. Um, so they don't themselves occupy a huge, clear position politically. They are kind of religious Zionist, but they're they're not neocon or paleoconservative in the US way. Um, so I'm not sure that I would take too much from the commentary bringing up Hazoni, except for saying the Talmud wants you to step into the inquiry too. Um, in this case, at any rate, Mark Angel has tended to be not very personally, not super conservative politically himself. So it's kind of a it's kind of a muddy picture, I think.
Hmm.
Um, but we're actually going to see later today. Um, I didn't pull in Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah, but it is relevant for something that we'll look at. So hang in there because we're going to come back around to how many teachers ought one have. Um, so we're starting in on our first new piece, our first new Mishnah, which is Avot 1:5. Yosef ben Yochanan of Jerusalem said, "Let your house be open wide, and let the poor be part of your household, and do not converse much with one's wife." And the Hebrew here is literally the wife, meaning your wife. Like, let your house be opened. Don't talk much to your wife. Um, there's then a gloss from the editors of this thing who say, this is concerning one's wife, they said. How much more so with another person's wife? So they're now saying, look, the Yosei said, let your house be open wide, let the poor be part of your household, don't talk too much to your wife, and definitely don't talk to other people's wives. Based on this, the sages said, whenever someone converses a lot with his wife, he brings evil upon himself and neglects words of Torah, and ultimately he inherits Gehinnom. So Gehinnom is, you may have seen it as Gehenna at various points. It's sort of this shadowy underworld in the Bible. It's sometimes called Sheol. It's like a weird embodied purgatory space. So again, we have this kind of three-piece teaching, right? Let your house be open wide, let the poor be part of your household, don't converse much with your wife. And then you've got clarification and expansion in this spot. And we're going to see more clarification and expansions as we go through Avot. Um, anything seem particularly worrying to you in this text?
Well, I got two different messages there. Maybe they're complementary. One seemed, don't waste your time, women don't know anything. But the other one was, look, people have human impulses and human sexual impulses, and you need to be disciplined. And all this talk is not going to be a good thing towards keeping that discipline, that moral discipline. So those are the two strands I sort of took from it.
Yeah, it's not super clear that they're actually too worried about sexual morality here. I mean, just they are willing to say, we're worried about you being alone with women when
Hmm.
they mean it. It happens in other places in the Talmud and in the Mishnah. So they may not be thinking so much about that as much as they might be thinking, women don't learn Torah, you're wasting your time.
That's the depressing
Yeah,
explanation. Yeah, like women aren't worthy intellectually, so don't bother. Don't spend any time with them.
yeah,
Great. This is one of the foundations of our religion, tradition.
yeah. I mean, look, the rabbis don't exist in a women friendly environment and are not terribly friendly to women themselves, actually. We like to think of Judaism as being egalitarian, but that's kind of our story of Judaism in the modern period more than it is the story of Judaism for most of its history. Michael.
Yeah, well, women are. Can you hear me? Because
Yeah.
yeah, women are actually when it says that you'll neglect the words of Torah. It doesn't actually mean Torah. It means the rabbinic teachings, and women are prohibited from learning those things. It's not that they're not capable; it's that they're prohibited from learning those things. And since I'm just trying to give a more positive view, I guess.
Yeah,
Uh,
that is not
it's
more
very
positive.
unlike me, very unlike me to give a positive view of rabbinic teaching. But uh, but women are not allowed to study these things, and since uh, you're commanded to spend as much time as possible studying the Talmudic and rabbinic stuff, then you are wasting your time talking with women.
Yeah. I mean, there's not really a good way of characterizing this, right?
Right.
Um, it is worth noting that a lot of modern attempts to make this better do a couple of different things. So one of them is what the Koran, these folks, translation does, which is the translation says, um, let your house be open wide, let the poor join the members of your household, and do not gossip inordinately with women. This was said about one's wife, all the more so does it apply to another man's wife. So it translates sicha, which is like conversation, as gossip, right? Trying to kind of spruce up the image of this. Like you shouldn't be gossiping with women, as though men never gossip. Um, mm, and the commentary in this one actually does go for it and say the Torah provides a system of sexual morality, and so he's going all in. Mark Angel is going all in on the sexual concerns that aren't necessarily in the text, but he's reading them in because that's kind of where the tradition has gone, but it's not in full where the tradition went with this. That doesn't seem so great. There's not really a good way to sugarcoat this, right? Um, did I mention the rabbis are not always so subtle about their misogyny? Um, look, this is the early second century BCE. These are people who are around at the time of the Maccabean revolt, basically. Um, all of these people live in Palestine. And Jewish law has a bunch of misogynistic rules, including sotah, which is a ritual related to when a man suspects that his wife has committed adultery, has a prohibition on women serving as witnesses, has laws of menstruation that prevent women from touching other people, um, does not permit women to seek divorce, and can be divorced on their husband's whim. This is not a society that's friendly to women, period. The emerging Hellenistic world in which the rabbis lived was misogynistic, but at higher socioeconomic tiers, women had more opportunities. Some of them were public, some of them were involved in a religious practice. And these two rabbis, Rabbi Yossi from point A and Rabbi Yossi from point B, were known as being opposed to Hellenistic and non-Jewish culture. They are associated with a prohibition on Jews leaving. Can't live outside. Jews shouldn't live outside of Palestine. Never mind the fact that Jews were already living scattered across the Mediterranean by this point. These guys are associated with saying Jews have to stay here, and who were associated with a more hardline faction during the period of the Maccabean revolt. These were not the guys who were interested in any kind of assimilation. So they're worried about building up some kind of a wall around Jewish life. And one of the ways they are interested in building up that wall, or at least Rabbi Yossi number two here, is cordoning off men from women in ways that they saw elite men and elite women interacting in Hellenistic society. Because there were women priests for various sacrificial cults, and they knew that. Um, Greek society, Athenian society, produces the Lysistrata, right? This play that basically is a sex strike, where women try to end a war by we're not going to have sex with our husbands until they change. Um, it's not like they don't know about this stuff. It's not like they're not navigating a world where they speak Greek and understand what's going on in Greek culture. They do. They're opposed to it. So the misogyny is kind of multi-layered here. It isn't just women don't study Torah, don't waste your time with women, you're supposed to be studying Torah. It's also don't spend time with women, don't be Greek. The Greeks do this. We're not Greeks. We're trying very hard not to be Greeks. Don't even bother living outside the land of Israel. You shouldn't do that. The ban gets dropped on not living outside of the land of Israel, but like they try it for a while. Um, so they're not just being misogynistic. They're being misogynistic too. But there's more going on, right? Because this is still this period when um, right, this is the period of right around the Maccabean revolt, and Jews are trying to differentiate, and this is one of the ways to draw some of those lines, while at the same time retaining some of the old misogynistic standards too. Like we should not go, oh well, they're just trying to deal with the Greeks. Like, they're trying to deal with the Greeks at the expense of women. Um, and so they're creating this kind of sense of talking to women means being Greek, and it's a slippery slope and relegation to Gehenna, and you're going to neglect Torah. And the whole point of Pirkei Avot is, in part, this is the behavior we expect of a rabbi. So rabbis shouldn't do this. And from the perspective of the people who put Pirkei Avot together as a final text, the rabbis are by that point the political elite in Jewish life. So this is them piecing together teachings that they have and saying, this is what we expect of you, our students, who will themselves become rabbis. Don't behave like this. Commentaries talk about this. So Bartonora says about the whole, this is concerning his wife, how much more so? He says, the sages said in the Talmud, he, meaning God, tells a man what he conversed about, i.e., when you get up to heaven, you die and you go to heaven and you're being judged, God will say, I know what you said and how you gossiped with your wife. You wasted Torah time. That's a mark off of your record in deciding whether you go up or down. So by the time we get to the 15th century, this is like on the list of demerits and is being generalized to everybody. And then you have Joshua Culp's explanation. Now, this is somebody who is alive and working today as a scholar of rabbinic literature, and he says, we should keep in mind women did not receive the education that men received. Talking to women was considered the antithesis of Torah learning because they assumed women could not talk Torah. If we were to translate the advice in this section to our situation, the advice is to not waste one's time away with idle chat, for such chat limits the time one has to learn Torah. I'm not saying you have to buy his explanation. I'm simply saying that's his take on what we should take from this text. And then I have this little note down here. There are manuscript variants that amend this text to apply only to avoiding menstruating women for ritual purity reasons. Which means that there are people who were copying these texts by hand, passing them down, and got to this piece of the Mishnah and went, wow, that's bad. Hey, it can't possibly be saying what it's saying. It must really mean Torah scholars shouldn't be hanging around with women who are menstruating because it makes you ritually impure. And therefore added words to the Mishnah in their recopying of it to change what it says. Like we know that these things happen. And this is one of the places where it happens. Sometimes emendations like this are as simple as you will see this in medieval manuscripts from in Christianity. Every so often, you will get a monk who belongs to some kind of different version of Christianity or some slightly different theological tradition. And in recopying something, will do something like add the word not before or after it. Right. So if you think back to the early 90s, there was a lot of teenagers walking around going blah 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 blah. Not. Monks did this with their manuscripts. This is bigger than that. This is this is rabbis recopying the Mishnah by hand and saying, oh, this is really bad. We shouldn't say this. This must be what they meant. They must be talking about just don't talk with menstruating women because definitely, you don't want to be spending time with your wife while she's menstruating because you're in close proximity and the odds of becoming ritually impure are higher. And how much more so women that are not your spouse, which you really shouldn't be hanging around with anyway. Look, just it's menstruating women. And they changed the text. That is not, I mean, it's recognized that that's a change. And that's not the way most texts of this section read. But it is a trackable manuscript tradition. So here we have an example of a very specific example when this particular commentary, because it's put together by modern scholars who are actually concerned about, and some of them are feminist critics, drop a note and say, people tried to change this text. So this means that, like, in the 5th century, somebody realized we shouldn't be saying this. So even the tradition's not uniform on this, let alone Barton Earl, let alone Joshua Culp, let alone anything else. Oops. Okay, so before we move on, questions about that one? Because that was a big deep dive into textual traditions and the sociology of the Hellenistic Jewish world and all of that. If not, we will roll to the next one. So this is the next set of pairs, right? So I said at a certain point we start getting pairs of rabbis. This is the next set of pairs. Yehoshua ben Parachia and Nitai the Arbelite, and these are uh, Arbel is a name for any number of cities um, throughout the ancient Middle East, so it's hard to know which Arbel Nitai would have been from. Yehoshua ben Parachia and Nitai the Arbelite received the tradition from them, from the two Yosis. Yehoshua ben Parachia said, appoint a teacher for yourself, and acquire a companion for yourself, and judge every person with the scales tilted toward their worthiness. What do you make of this?
Well, go on.
No, go ahead, Toby.
Um, I read the commentary in this particular translation, and it kind of made sense. It was saying at least this is what I was thinking it was saying. When you meet people, you're evaluating them and putting them in one of three categories. There are those, I guess this is my interpretation of the interpretation. The first category is people who can who know more than you, who could teach you something. So you want to get close to one of them. They'd be a teacher for you. Category two is more your peer, your equal. And then, according to the translation I read, it gave kind of a little recipe for how you might treat a peer, a friend, called it a friend. And it was kind of nice. It'd be someone you trust and someone you care about and someone you're willing to spend time on, and a whole list of things like that. And you're loyal to, and you empathize with, and you share a life with. And then the third category, according to my translation of the translation, was somebody who you make a snap judgment of and are judgmental about and sort of dismissive. Well, this is saying put the brakes on. Maybe don't be so judgmental. Maybe they have a reason for what they're doing, and just, cool it a little bit with that category. Anyway, that's what I got out of
Yeah,
the trans.
and that's definitely what the commentary on that says in the Koran version, and that's how it's taught in the modern world a lot, right?
I
Who do
liked it.
you who do you want to have as a teacher? Who should be a friend? Remember that everybody's going through their own struggles. Um,
Give people a benefit of the doubt.
Give
I
people
like
benefit
that.
of the doubt.
Yeah.
Um, and it sort of says that. Um, but it's potentially more complicated. It always is. It's the rabbis, right? So here we go. Bart Nora has a very different take, and his take is actually kind of resting in older commentaries, so it's worth taking a look at. Bart Nora says on appoint yourself a teacher. He says Rambam interpreted this as Rambam, Maimonides, wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. It was an Arab language commentary, got translated into Hebrew, which is how, when it's used in most Jewish study, that's really how it's accessed, is this Hebrew translation. Bartenura says Rambam interpreted this as, even if that person isn't suitable to be your Rav, so this person shouldn't be your rabbi, do it anyway,
Hmm.
and don't learn on your own.
Hmm.
Don't teach yourself. And he says, on acquire a companion, and even if you need to inquire them with dearest blood, this is like, spend a lot of money essentially, and shower him with wealth so that you can acquire his friendship. With a Rav, it's not applicable to say acquire a Rav for yourself, since a Rav needs to teach for free. Bartenura is not talking about buying a friend. Bartnora means, and the Hebrew word here is chaver, companion, friend. It's a flexible word, but what what this is what Yeshua ben Parachia is getting at, says Bartnora, is we don't do Torah alone. You cannot teach yourself. You need a teacher. And if your only choice is somebody who really isn't suitable, but they know more than you, that's your teacher. Latch onto that person. On Acquire a Companion, he's like, look, our tradition is not meant for you to learn in a room by yourself. You need a teacher to correct you, but you also need someone to study with because this is not sit down and read it by yourself material. This is material that you debate. This is material that you hash out. So you need a study partner. And if you have to pay for that study partner, then you pay for that study partner. You buy their friendship so that you have someone to study with. And you can go to your teacher, you can go to your Rav later. And did we get it right? And he says, but with a Rav, it's not applicable to say acquire a Rav for yourself because a Rav needs to teach for free. This is part of, okay, sometimes you have to know the rest of the tradition to know the tradition. There is a passage in Pirkei Avot that kind of says people who teach Torah can't be paid for teaching Torah. And so this is Bartnura saying you don't pay a rabbi to teach you, which means that there's all kinds of schemes for figuring out how to pay rabbis to teach people. Right. This is rabbinic Judaism we're talking about. The work is in finding the loopholes. But Bartner is saying you don't set a fee for your teacher. But if you have to set a fee to find someone who will sit with you and debate with you so that you learn together, you need to do it. We do not study alone. Torah is social. And this applies to exercising judgment. So we use the word judge flexibly, right? This text is so aseh lecha rav, make for yourself, appoint for yourself a rabbi, ukne lecha chaver, acquire a friend, and kne here is literally the word for buy. And then the have dan et kol ha'adam lakaf zehut, and let judgment. So dan is the verb version of din, of judge, or dayan is judge, din is judgment, dan is judging. And you need to judge every person as though they are worthy. As in, you are a rabbi, or you're becoming a rabbi. That's who this text is for. You need to give people the benefit of the doubt when you enter judgment in their cases. So he says, on scales tilted, when the issue is being weighed and there's no basis to tilt it this way or that, for example, with a person whose deeds, we don't know whether they're good or bad, and he's done something that could be judged as meritorious or as liable, and he's using chovah, this word for liable here, is like legally liable. You are liable for negligence or breaching contract or whatever. It's chovahs. You are accountable for some kind of penalty. He's done something that could be judged as meritorious or as liable, The righteous thing is to judge him as meritorious, but if someone's known to be evil, you can hold him liable. If you can't figure the issue out based on the evidence, look at the person. And if you don't know them to be bad, assume that they're good and enter judgment in a way that reflects that. So the modern version of reading that is Mark Angel's commentary and Jonathan Sacks's translation. Right? You kind of see the best in people and try not to hold things against them and understand their circumstances. But this text, on its plain sense, is really saying we don't do Torah by ourselves. You cannot teach yourself. You need someone to study with you. You shouldn't be reading this by yourself alone. You reach the wrong conclusions. You need to be corrected by a teacher. And you have to apply that same social sense to how you judge, how you do the job of being a rabbi in the way that rabbis were 2,000 years ago, which is judging cases rather than, you know, teaching and doing all these other things. It's a very different way of looking at it. You need IQ and EQ. You have to study with other people. Right? It doesn't seem like that's what the text is saying, but that's, you know, each translation kind of approaches it a little bit differently. Toby.
Yeah. So is this piece of wisdom to be applied just to rabbis, or is this to anyone learning? You know, that I don't have personal experience with a yeshiva, but my understanding is this is how learning is done with your havruta. And
Yeah,
I know that there is an organization, oh my gosh, how could I forget their name? But anyway, I did. And they set up sessions where you're studying with a havruta, you know.
yeah. So there's a number of different organizations that do that. There's an organization called Svara that actually does this with Talmud. Even if you don't know any Hebrew, like as long as you know the Hebrew alphabet, you can start with them. You're probably thinking of Hadar's Project Zug.
Yes, that's
Yeah,
exactly what I'm thinking of.
right. So Project Zug does that with all kinds of different Jewish learning.
Yeah. Mhm.
Zug means pair, by the way. So the Zugot are the pairs of rabbis that we've been looking at. Um, yeah, this is Bart Nura kind of going, this is really talking about Jewish study. Um, and if you were to ask him, he would say, well, why would you, assuming that you are a male, because that's part of his assumption, assuming you are a male and studying Jewish things, why would you not want to become a rabbi? This is how we propagate knowledge in our tradition. Is you have a Rav, you study in pairs. You don't do this by yourself. Um, this is very much what he's saying.
But it seems to me a very good idea for education, period, of anybody.
Well, so it is, and about the best possible way of not learning Talmud is trying to do it yourself. I mean, this isn't just a good idea. This is a text that's really quite difficult to deal with, um, for many, many, many reasons. It's very easy to misread it, even in the original, right? There's no punctuation, or there's very little punctuation. There's really no punctuation. There's no vowels. It's in mixed Hebrew and Aramaic with some Greek words thrown in, and everything's written in Hebrew letters. And there's commentaries off to the side, and you can't even understand the plain sense of the text of the Talmud without at least one of the commentaries off to the side. And it's not obvious about which biblical verses it's citing. It'll give you a couple words from a verse, but it's not even really citing that verse. And Like you need other intellectual horsepower. It's only people who really are very advanced who can actually sit down and do any of it by themselves, right? And you hear these stories about rabbis who, if you put down a volume of the Talmud and you take a pin and you drive the pin through it, they can tell you what letter is on either side of the pin all the way down through the volume or whatever. I don't know if that's actually possible. I've never seen it happen, but like that's not how most people are. You actually do a lot better studying these texts if you're doing it with another person and with somebody who's really good at this particular mode of study, correcting your errors, which is how this works in a yeshiva, right? You can find videos of study happening in a yeshiva, and there's like these desks where students are facing each other and they're talking at each other back and forth, and it's like 100 pairs in a room, and it's the volume is incredibly loud, and there's a particular patter to it, and you learn these technical terms that tell you where the argument is going, and this happens for hours on end, and then you have shiur where the rabbi comes up and he explains everything and corrects everybody's misinterpretations and things like that. That's how rabbinic study works. Pirkei Avot is not meant to be personally edifying for the Jew on the street, at least not by the rabbis. It's meant for their folks. I mean, really, the way we use it now is not at all what the rabbis imagined people would be using this text for. This is the other guy in the pair. This is the next one. Nitai the Arbalite says, keep your distance from a bad neighbor. Don't befriend the wicked. Do not despair of retributive judgment. Okay. What do you think of that? Seems like good advice, right? Toby.
I, it does seem like good advice. You're going to get involved in bad stuff. However, there is the competing idea that folks need a friend. But what I'm taking this as is don't rely on these particular folks. Maybe you want to try other things like helpful interventions, but don't rely on them as equals because they're not reliable helpers.
Yeah. So I mentioned Avot de Rabbi Natan, and here we have a bit from Avot de Rabbi Natan, and you'll see that there's a lot of square brackets and a lot of parentheses. That's in the text. There are two versions of Avot de Rabbi Natan, like two manuscript traditions, and they're not 100% the same. Keep away from a bad neighbor. And he's like, it's all the same, whether it's a neighbor at home or someone outside or someone in the field. Meaning, those who are harmed come to it only because of the transgression of the wicked person. Like a good person gets wrapped up in what a bad person does. The wicked person's transgression caused the wall of the righteous person to weaken. And the word here for wall is kotel, like the wall. How so? A weakness appears in the wall between the wicked person and the righteous person on the wicked person's side. And then on the righteous person's side, the weakness pushes through because of the wicked person's transgression. Rabbi Ishmael, son of Yochanan ben Baroka, would say, woe to the wicked person, woe to their neighbor, because the transgressions of the wicked cause the wall of the righteous person to weaken. So it says harm. It's sometimes translated as leprosy or disease or impurity, because the idea is your neighbor next to you starts doing undermines the wall, and that carries over to you. So you can hang around with them and they kind of bring you down with them, is the idea. So Barton Ura kind of makes this a little clearer. He says, so you won't learn from their actions. Keep away from them. And further, so that you won't be punished along with him during his downfall. Woe to the wicked person and woe to their neighbor. Don't befriend the wicked, since the sages said, anyone who clings to the wicked, even if they themselves don't emulate their actions, he grants reward, as in God judges you, as if you had emulated their actions. What's this like? You enter the home of a tanner. Even if you take nothing from there at all, nevertheless, a vile smell collects and goes out with them, right? So tanners are not part of the world that we live in our neighborhoods day to day, but tanning is a very vile smelling process. And tanners smelled bad. Women, the rabbi said women could be granted divorces if they married tanners and just couldn't deal with it. It was bad. Like this was really not a smell you wanted to be around. Bartner said, on don't despair of retributive punishment, so that you won't say, this guy's deeds succeed, so I'm going to stick with him. For time for him is all play. Thus he, Nitai said, don't despair of retributive judgment. Know that punishment will come upon them quickly, because their downfall will come suddenly. Like you won't know it, and all of a sudden everything will come falling down. They're going to be punished. Assume they'll be punished. Don't think they won't be, and don't think that you'll be spared. So we're going to end on not this slide, but the next one, because we do have a real world modern reference point for this that I think points out what Pirkei Avot is actually about in a more clear way. Stuff on the left-hand side is stuff we've seen in Pirkei Avot. Stuff on the right-hand side are the federal canons of judicial conduct. Judges should maintain and enforce high standards of conduct, adhering personally and preserve integrity and independence of the judiciary. Judges should respect and comply with the law and act in a manner that promotes confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary. A judge should not allow relationships to affect their impartiality. A judge should not belong to an organization that practices invidious discrimination. My friend's bad, but he does all kinds of fun stuff. I'm hanging out with him. A judge's duties should take precedence over all other activities. Don't talk to your wife. Don't spend too much time with your wife. A judge may engage in extrajudicial activities unless they detract from the dignity of the office, interfere with official duties, undercut impartiality, etc. And this is why I keep saying Pirkei Avot, in its original setting, is expressing expectations for rabbis. Don't be Greek, find a teacher. Be charitable in judgment when you can. Stay away from bad people. Make your home like a court. Constantly learn. Open your home to the poor. Don't be idle. Don't expect reward for this. You don't get paid extra because you're a judge. You don't get paid extra because you're a rabbi. So this is kind of where we're landing tonight this is one way to think about what's going on in Pirkei Avot. And the more literally you translate it, the more it seems to work like this. Whereas some of our modern translations and the modern commentaries are taking the words and making them work for us now and softening things and applying the same principle but in a different way. So when we're thinking about, does Pirkei Avot work for us? It's worth remembering where its starting point is, and that it's not always going to work so well the more we look into the tradition and how the tradition understands it as a text. And then we have decisions to make about how we want to use the text, right? That's our power and our privilege as modern people, as we get to say, okay, now what do you do with that?